The smoke was visible from 3 miles out, a black column rising against the copper blaze of the Arizona sky, and Wilhelmina Chandler rode toward it without slowing her mare even once. It was the autumn of 1873, and the land around Colton Creek had not seen rain in 41 days. The grasses had gone to yellow straw, the creek itself had thinned to a muddy trickle between cracked banks, and the whole territory had taken on the quality of something waiting to burn. As it turned out, it had not waited long. The settlement of Harlan's Crossing, a modest collection of 12 homesteads, a trading post, a livery stable, and a small schoolhouse built with donated lumber from 3 different counties, had caught fire sometime before dawn. By the time the sun had fully claimed the eastern horizon, the settlement was fully involved. Bernard Yates had been riding the southern fence line of the Kellerman Ranch, where he had hired on for the season, when he first saw the smoke. He was 28 years old and had been working cattle and horses across New Mexico and Arizona for the better part of a decade. He had seen grass fires, barn fires, and one terrible night in Tucson when a saloon went up and took 2 neighboring buildings with it. He knew what a fire of this size meant, and he turned his horse toward it without thinking. He arrived at the edge of Harlan's Crossing to find a scene that was already past the point of any organized effort. The trading post was a skeleton of burning timbers. 3 of the homesteads along the eastern row were gone entirely, their roof beams fallen inward, their walls collapsed into heaps of glowing orange ruin. Several people stood in a loose, stunned cluster at the northern end of the main track, some wrapped in blankets despite the heat, some simply standing with their arms at their sides with the dull look of people who had lost the capacity for immediate reaction. A man Bernard recognized as Joe Hartwell, who sometimes traded horses out of the livery, was working a hand pump at the well with the mechanical desperation of a person who knows the effort is useless, but cannot bring himself to stop. Bernard dismounted and tied his horse to a hitching post that stood far enough from the flames to be safe, and he went to the cluster of survivors to see what could be done. It was there, standing at the edge of that group, that he first laid eyes on Wilhelmina Chandler. She was not standing still like the others. She was moving with swift, purposeful strides toward her horse, a gray-dappled mare with black stockings and a white blaze on her nose. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark chestnut hair pulled back in a knot at the nape of her neck, several strands of it come loose and falling across her face in the heat-driven wind. She wore a practical dark wool skirt and a cream-colored blouse with the sleeves already rolled to the elbow, and over both she had a man's canvas work coat that was too large for her, its cuffs turned back to free her hands. Her face was flushed with heat, and her expression was entirely concentrated, the expression of someone who had already made a decision and was now simply executing it. What drew Bernard's eye to her more than anything was what she was doing. She was tying a wet blanket across her saddle, not just draped over it, but tied, secured at each corner, and she had a second blanket soaking in the water trough beside the well. As he watched, she wrung it out partially, folded it over her own shoulders, and without a word to anyone around her, she turned her horse and rode directly into the burning settlement. Bernard watched her go. He looked around at the survivors. A woman named Mrs. Pratt, who he knew slightly from occasional supply runs into town, grabbed his arm. "That is Mina Chandler," Mrs. Pratt said. "Her husband passed in July. She has no business going in there, but nobody can stop her. She says there are still people inside." "Are there?" Bernard asked. Mrs. Pratt wrung her hands. "The Alderman family, old Clarence Alderman, he cannot walk since his fall last spring, and his wife will not leave him. Their daughter Clara went in to try to get them out and hasn't come back. Mina has already gone in twice. She brought out the school teacher and a child the first time, brought out the alderman daughter the second time, unconscious from the smoke. Clara is over there, breathing, thank God, but the old couple," she could not finish the sentence. Bernard looked toward the burning settlement. He could see Wilhelmina Chandler disappear around a corner of a building that had not yet fully caught, a gap in the flames that would not stay open long. He stood there for a moment. There was no logical reason for a man who had arrived 3 minutes ago, who did not know these people, who had no particular obligation to any of them, to go into a burning settlement after a woman he had never met. He knew this. He understood it clearly. He turned back to the well, pulled up a bucket of water, and soaked his own bandana through. He tied it over the lower half of his face, walked to his horse, and reached into his saddlebag for the spare length of rope he always carried. Then he waited. Wilhelmina came back out. She was carrying nothing, her face tight with frustration. She rode back through the gap, slid from her saddle, and went immediately to the water trough where the second blanket still soaked. "They are barricaded in the back room," she said, and it took Bernard a moment to realize she was speaking to him, even though she had not yet looked directly at him. Clarence Alderman built that room from river stone, said it was going to be his permanent room since he could not navigate stairs anymore. Stone does not burn as fast, but the smoke. She shook her head and pulled the soaked blanket back across her shoulders. "I need to find another way in. The front door is blocked by a burning beam." "How big is the beam?" Bernard asked. She looked at him then. Her eyes were brown, sharp, and direct. She assessed him in a single glance, the way that people who have spent time in difficult country learn to assess strangers, quickly and without sentiment. "You are not from here," she said. "No, ma'am, I ride for the Kellerman Ranch 3 miles south. I saw the smoke." "The beam is about 12 feet and probably 300 pounds of burning pine," she said. "I cannot move it myself." "I have rope," he said. She looked at the rope. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but the recognition that he was useful and that she was not going to waste time arguing about it. "Then come," she said, and she turned back toward the fire. He went in with her on that third trip. The heat was remarkable. Bernard had been in hot places, had ridden through the Sonoran Desert in August and worked branding fires in the full blaze of June noons, but this was different. This was heat that pressed against a person from all sides at once, that found the gap between collar and neck and pushed inside, that made the simple act of breathing feel like an act of will. He kept his soaked bandana tight across his nose and mouth, and followed Wilhelmina Chandler through the burning track of Harlan's Crossing with his eyes half shut against the smoke. She knew exactly where she was going. She did not hesitate at intersections or pause to consider direction. She had been in here twice already, and she moved with the purposeful confidence of someone who had mapped the space in their memory. They reached the Alderman house, or what remained of it, the front portion fully engaged with flame, the back section still fighting the fire behind its thick stone walls. The burning beam across the doorway was exactly as she had described it, large, heavy, and actively on fire at both ends. Bernard secured his rope to the middle of it, then looked for an anchor point outside the direct line of the flames. He found a hitching post sunk into the hard earth 6 feet from the doorway, and he looped the rope around it twice and told Wilhelmina to hold the free end taut while he pushed the beam from inside. It was brutal work. The beam was heavy even without the fire, and the fire made everything worse. He pushed with his shoulder and felt the heat through his coat like a brand pressing against him. Wilhelmina pulled from outside, her boots planted in the dirt, her whole body leaning back against the rope with a strength that surprised him even in that moment. The beam shifted, groaned, shifted again. And then it rolled to the side with a crash of sparks and a rush of heat that made Bernard stagger backward. The doorway was clear. He went through first, Wilhelmina directly behind him, and they found the Aldermans in the stone room at the back of the house. Clarence Alderman was a large man, even in his current condition, and he was unconscious from the smoke that had been seeping under the door despite the rolled blankets his wife had pressed against the gap. His wife, Margaret, was conscious but weakening, and she clutched her husband's hand with both of hers and would not release it. "We are going to get you out," Wilhelmina told her with a steadiness in her voice that Bernard would remember for a long time afterward. "Both of you. Do you hear me, Margaret? Both of you." Bernard got his arms under Clarence Alderman and lifted. The man was heavy and completely limp, and for a moment Bernard was not sure he could manage it, but he found his footing and got the man up and moving. Wilhelmina took Margaret Alderman by the hand and pulled her after them, and they came back out through the cleared doorway and into the burning air of the settlement, and then through the gap in the flames, and then out into the open air beyond the settlement's edge. Bernard set Clarence Alderman down in the dirt and straightened up, and his back screamed at him and his lungs pulled at the cleaner outside air like a man emerging from underwater. He looked over and found Wilhelmina helping Margaret Alderman to the ground beside her husband, already checking his breathing with 2 fingers pressed to his neck. "He's alive," Wilhelmina said. "Pulse is there." Bernard nodded. He pulled the bandana from his face. His eyes were burning from the smoke and he rubbed them with the back of his hand. Around them, the surviving members of the settlement were converging on the Aldermans. Joe Hartwell arrived at a run with 2 other men. Mrs. Pratt came with water and clean cloths. There was the organized chaos of immediate care, and Wilhelmina moved through it efficiently, directing, advising, pressing a wet cloth to Clarence Alderman's face and coaching Margaret on how to help him breathe more easily. Bernard stood back and watched her work. She went in 2 more times after that. On the 4th trip, she went in alone while he was helping move the Aldermans farther from the flames. And when she came back out, she was carrying a wooden box pressed tight against her chest that she took directly to a young woman sitting in the dirt at the edge of the crowd. He did not know what was in the box, but the young woman took it with both arms around it and pressed her face against it and sobbed, and Wilhelmina held her for a moment with one hand on the back of her head. On the 5th trip, Wilhelmina rode in and Bernard rode in beside her without being asked. They were pulling furniture from a house on the far western edge that had not yet caught, dragging out tables and chairs and one heavy bureau that took both of them working together, things that could be saved for the people who had lost everything else. There was something wordless and efficient about working beside her. She did not explain her decisions or wait for his agreement. She moved and he moved with her, and they fit together in the work with a naturalness that had nothing to do with familiarity and everything to do with the simple fact that they both understood what needed doing. On the way out from the 5th trip, a section of roof on the adjacent building collapsed with a sound like a thunderclap and a shower of sparks that rained across the track. Wilhelmina's horse shied hard to the right, and Wilhelmina, who had a bedroll tucked under one arm that she was saving for the survivors, lost her balance in the saddle for one terrible second. Bernard, riding close on her left, reached across and got his hand on her arm and steadied her. She found her seat again. The horse settled. She looked at him over the length of his arm. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was quiet in a way it had not been during the work. Something different moved through the words. "Yes, ma'am," he said and released her arm. That was not a moment he had planned. It simply happened the way things happen in the middle of crisis, naturally and without orchestration, and it left something behind it in the air between them that was difficult to name. He counted her trips. He had not meant to. It was simply what his attention did. First trip when she had come out without the Aldermans. Second trip before he arrived. Then 3, 4, 5. He sat outside on his horse at the edge of the flames on the 6th trip, and watched the clock of his own heartbeat while she was inside. And when she came back out with a saddlebag full of someone's preserved food stores, he felt the tension in his chest release in a way that was entirely disproportionate to what he knew about this woman, which was almost nothing. She went in the 7th time as the sun was approaching noon, and the fire was beginning to run out of things to burn. Bernard watched her ride into the smoke. He waited. He watched the place where the flames formed a corridor, the gap she always used, which was growing narrower as the buildings on either side burned lower. He counted his own breathing. He counted the hoofbeats of his horse shifting its weight behind him. He stopped counting and went in with her. He found her at the far eastern end of the settlement, in a house that was still largely standing because it had been built from adobe with only a wooden roof, and the roof had burned away but the walls remained. She was in what had been a back room, and she had found something. She was kneeling beside a small wooden chest, and when Bernard came through the doorway she looked up at him with an expression that was startled and then, very quickly, something else. Something that was close to relief, and he thought that surprised her. "There is nobody left inside," she said. "I was checking to be certain. I did not want to leave if she stopped." She looked back at the chest. This belonged to the Ray's family. They got out. Their daughter was the one asking everyone if anyone had seen it. "Then we should take it to them," Bernard said. She nodded. She picked up the chest and stood, and he stepped aside to let her through the doorway first, and they came back out into the burning air together and rode back through the narrowing gap in the flames and out into the open on the other side. And that was the last trip. Afterward, in the long hot afternoon that followed, the surviving people of Harlan's Crossing organized themselves with the particular resilience of frontier people who have no other choice. Families were sorted. Injuries were tended. The dead, and there were two of them, a man named Edgar Sims, who had been caught in the first rush of flames before dawn, and an older woman named Patricia Marsh, who had not survived the smoke, were laid out with the dignity that the circumstances allowed. Joe Hartwell rode out to spread word to the neighboring ranches and settlements. A man named Collins, who had kept his supply wagon on the edge of the settlement and saved it from the fire, began distributing what he could spare from his stores. Bernard helped with all of it. He was a practical man who knew how to do useful things, and there was no shortage of useful things to do. He helped shore up a partially standing building that was being designated as communal shelter. He helped dig a fire break so that the smoldering edges of the settlement could not crawl outward into the dry grass. He watered horses and helped inventory the surviving food stores. Through all of it, he was aware of Wilhelmina Chandler in the way that a person is aware of a particular sound in a room full of sounds, not always looking, but always knowing where she was. She worked without ceasing. She organized the women with children into the communal shelter. She sat with Margaret Alderman for an hour, simply sitting, not working, just present, and Bernard noticed that Clarence Alderman had regained consciousness during that hour and was breathing more steadily. As the afternoon wore toward evening and the fire had burned down to low, smoldering heaps, Bernard found himself at the water trough, washing the smoke and ash from his hands and face. He heard boots on the ground behind him and turned. Wilhelmina Chandler stood there with 2 tin cups of coffee, which was clearly a miracle given the circumstances, and she held one out to him. He took it. "Where did you find coffee in all of this?" "Mrs. Collins had a good-sized tin in her wagon, and she has been brewing it on the tailgate since noon," Wilhelmina said. "She says it is the most useful thing she can contribute, and I think she is probably right." Bernard looked down at the coffee and then back at her. She had washed her face too, sometime recently, and the ash was mostly gone, though there was still a streak of soot along her jaw that she had missed. Her hair was still partly down from where it had escaped its knot during the morning. In the late afternoon light, with the western sky going to orange behind her, she looked tired in the deep way that only honest hard work produces, and she looked, he thought, like someone who had spent the day being exactly what the situation needed. "I am Bernard Yates," he said. "I know," she said. "Mrs. Pratt told me. She also told me you helped carry Clarence Alderman out and that you have been working all day." She paused. "I did not thank you properly before." "You do not need to thank me," he said. "I do," she said, and she said it with the directness he was already beginning to recognize as simply part of how she spoke. "You rode into a burning settlement to help people you do not know. That is not nothing. You rode into it several times before I arrived," he said. "All I did was come along." Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile, not quite, but something adjacent to warmth. "You came along into a burning building and helped me move a 300-pound beam," she said. "That is more than coming along." "I had rope," he said, and that did produce a small, brief, genuine smile, which was there and then was not there, but which he kept in his mind like a coin kept in a breast pocket. She looked out toward the smoldering ruins of the settlement. The sun was getting low, and the sky was enormous and amber above them, and the smoke was thinning now into a pale gray haze rather than the black column it had been that morning. "I knew most of these people," she said quietly. "My husband and I came out here 3 years ago. We built a homestead 4 miles east of here." She paused. "Thomas passed in July, fever." "I am sorry," Bernard said. She nodded once. "Harlan's Crossing was our nearest town. We came here for supplies, for church on Sundays when we went, for everything that a community provides." She looked at the ruins. "These people helped me bury my husband. Mrs. Pratt sat with me for 3 days when I could not get out of bed. Clara Alderman, who you helped pull out of that house this morning, she brought meals out to my homestead every third day for 6 weeks." Bernard said nothing. He understood that she was not asking for his response to any of this. She was simply placing it in front of him so that it had context. "I could not stand back and watch it burn," she said. "No," he said. "I did not think you could." She looked at him then with a directness that was startling. "You did not know me this morning," she said. "No," he said. "But I watched you for about 30 seconds before I got my rope out, and I thought I had a reasonable understanding." The almost smile again. It was brief and carefully contained, but it was real. They drank their coffee in the darkening afternoon beside the water trough while the community of Harlan's Crossing moved around them, and they did not say a great deal more. But when the light had gone fully red and people were beginning to settle for what would be a difficult night in the remaining shelter, Wilhelmina Chandler turned to him and said, in the same direct way she had said everything else, "Where are you sleeping tonight?" "I will ride back to the Kellerman Ranch and let them know what has happened here," Bernard said. "I should have gone hours ago." She nodded. "Will you come back?" He looked at her. The question was simply practical. There was work to be done here tomorrow and the day after and for many days to come. She was asking if he was the kind of person who showed up. That was all she was asking. "Yes," he said, "I will come back." He meant it practically. But something in the saying of it felt like more than practical. He rode back to the Kellerman Ranch in the dark and told Hal Kellerman what had happened at Harlan's Crossing. Kellerman, a decent man with a pragmatic heart and a good wife, sat on his porch and listened to the whole account, and then said that Bernard could take 2 days off from the fence work to help the settlement get back on its feet, and that he would send his wife into town to organize a supply donation. Bernard lay in his bunk that night with the smell of smoke still in his hair, and thought about a woman with chestnut hair and direct brown eyes who rode into a burning settlement without hesitation, and who had extended a cup of coffee to a stranger at the end of it as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He had met a great many people in his years of working across the territory. He had liked some of them and respected fewer of them and trusted fewer still. He could not have fully articulated what it was about Wilhelmina Chandler that was different. It was something about the complete absence of performance in everything she did. She had not been brave in a showy way. She had been brave in a practical, efficient, necessary way. The way a person is when the bravery is just what the situation costs, and they have already decided to pay it without making a production of the payment. He was back at Harlan's Crossing before 8 in the morning. She was already at work when he arrived, sorting through a pile of salvaged materials with Clara Alderman, who was pale and still moving carefully from the effects of the smoke inhalation, but upright and working. Wilhelmina saw him come and gave him a single nod, and then went back to what she was doing, and somehow that nod felt warmer than a more elaborate greeting would have. The days that followed were the building days. Word had spread to the surrounding ranches and settlements with the speed that serious misfortune always travels, and people came to Harlan's Crossing with lumber and nails and food and clothing and tools, the particular generosity of frontier communities that know that the next fire or the next drought or the next hard winter might be their own. Bernard worked from early morning until the light was gone every day, and Wilhelmina worked beside him or near him or across the settlement from him. And at the end of each day, they found their way to the same rough camp table that Mrs. Collins set up near her wagon, and they ate and talked. They talked about practical things at first. What needed doing tomorrow, whether the adobe walls of the Ray's house could be repaired or whether a new structure would serve better, whether the well was deep enough to survive another dry month, whether the surviving stores would last until a supply wagon could be organized from Tucson. Then they began to talk about other things. She told him about coming out from Ohio with Thomas Chandler in the spring of 1870, newly married and entirely certain that she knew what frontier life would require and entirely wrong about the specific nature of that requirement. She told it with a dry humor that made him laugh, and he thought she liked making him laugh. She told him about the first winter, which had been brutal, and about Thomas, who had been a good man, steadfast and kind, a farmer with enormous patience and genuine love for the land. She spoke of her husband with a settled grief, not raw, not performed, but real, the grief of someone who has had 3 months to begin the long work of integrating a loss. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about following his older brother west at 19, and finding that the territory suited him better than anything he had left behind. He told her about the years of working cattle and horses, about the particular freedom and particular loneliness of that life, about learning to be self-sufficient in ways that were useful and in ways that were, upon reflection, not entirely healthy. "What do you mean by that?" she asked him. They were sitting at the camp table on the 4th evening, with the stars fully out above the desert and a fire burning low in the ring that Joe Hartwell had built for communal warmth. The night was cool, as Arizona autumn nights always were after the heat of the day, and she had her canvas coat wrapped around her again. "I mean that a person can get accustomed to relying on no one," he said, "and can start to mistake that for strength when some part of it is just habit." She considered this. Thomas used to say that independence was a virtue that became a vice if you practiced it too long in isolation, she said. He was not a man who expressed things that way very often, so when he did it tended to stick. "He sounds like a man worth listening to," Bernard said. "He was," she said simply. There was a comfortable silence between them. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the shelter a child was crying softly and being soothed. A coyote called from the dark hills to the east. "Can I ask you something?" Bernard said. "You can ask," she said. "When you rode in the first time this morning," he said, meaning the first morning, the day of the fire, "was there a moment where you thought about not going in?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No, is that strange?" "I think it might be remarkable," he said. She looked at him. In the firelight her face was serious and open at the same time. "I have been thinking about it since," she said, "about why it did not feel like a choice. And I think the answer is that those people have been my people for 3 years, and when your people are in trouble you simply go. There is nothing remarkable about it." "Most people would argue with that," he said. "Most people did," she said, nodding toward the cluster of survivors she had passed on her way in. "But they were afraid, and fear is reasonable, and I am not criticizing them. I was afraid too. I simply decided to be afraid while moving rather than afraid while standing still." Bernard looked at her for a long moment. "That," he said, "is one of the most sensible things I have ever heard a person say." She looked faintly surprised, and then she laughed. It was a short, genuine laugh, startled out of her by his sincerity, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh fully, and it landed somewhere in the center of his chest with a warmth that spread outward. He rode back to the Kellerman ranch that night feeling something that he could not entirely name, something that was not quite contentment because it had an edge of longing to it, the longing of a person who is sitting in the warmth of a fire and knows they are about to have to go back out into the cold. He returned to Harlan's Crossing the following morning and the morning after that. Hal Kellerman, who was a perceptive man and not unkind about it, observed after the second week that Bernard was logging considerably more hours at Harlan's Crossing than at the ranch fence line, and said nothing beyond, "The settlement needs hands and you have done good work here. The fence will keep." By the end of the second week, the beginnings of 3 new structures were up, and the Alderman house had been repaired enough for the old couple to return to it with a communal roster of people checking on them daily. The schoolhouse was being planned in earnest, the town having decided to put that up before any of the commercial buildings as a matter of priority, which Bernard thought said something good about the character of the place. He and Wilhelmina had settled into a particular rhythm. They worked together when the work called for it and separately when it did not, and in the evenings they talked. One evening she brought her horse alongside his on the ride back to the edge of the settlement, and they rode together in companionable quiet for almost half a mile before she said, unprompted, "You do not have to keep coming back, you know. The worst is over. There are enough hands now." "I know," he said. "Then why do you?" she asked, not challenging, simply asking. He thought about being evasive and decided against it. "Because the work is good," he said, and because he paused, looking for the exact words. "Because I find the evenings here considerably better than the evenings at the Kellerman bunkhouse." She looked at him. The horses moved together on the sandy track. "The evenings," she repeated. "The conversation," he said. She looked ahead again. He could see a small smile working at the corner of her mouth. "The conversation," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Stop calling me ma'am," she said. "You have pulled a burning beam out of a doorway with me. My name is Wilhelmina. Mina, if you prefer, most people do." "Wilhelmina," he said, because he liked the sound of it, all 4 syllables, and he thought she noticed that. She looked at him with those direct brown eyes, and something complicated moved through them, and then she looked ahead again. "All right, Bernard," she said. "The evenings are better here." It was 3 days after that conversation that he kissed her. He had not planned it. Planning was not really the right framework for what happened. They had been working on the frame of the new schoolhouse late into the afternoon, and the last 2 people remaining at the site had been themselves. And when the light had gone orange and they had set down their tools and were walking toward the water trough, she had said something about how Thomas had always wanted there to be a school in the settlement, and there had been a catch in her voice that was there, and then gone, and she had pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was managing something. And Bernard had stopped walking, and she had stopped too, and he had said her name, just her name, and when she looked at him he had touched her face, one hand along her jaw gently, asking without asking. She had gone very still. Then she had leaned into his hand just slightly, the smallest possible movement, and he had kissed her. It was brief. It was tender. It held in it a great deal of what neither of them had said yet, and some of what they had. When he drew back, she looked at him with an expression that was searching and careful and not unwelcoming, and she said quietly, I am still. It has only been 3 months, Bernard." "I know," he said. He did not move away. He kept his hand where it was. "I am not asking for anything that you are not ready to give." "What are you asking for?" she said. "Time," he said. "That is all, just time." She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were clear and honest and a little raw. "You should know," she said, "that I do not do anything halfway. If this is going to be something, it will be something real. I cannot manage anything less than that." "Neither can I," he said, and he meant it in a way that reached down into the part of him that had been working cattle in lonely country for 10 years and quietly admitting to himself that something was missing. She nodded once, slowly. "And time," she said, "and honesty, those are my terms." "Those are good terms," he said. She stepped back from his hand and he let her go, and they walked to the water trough and washed the sawdust from their hands in the ordinary way, and something had shifted between them that was permanent, that the evening sky above the desert and the half-built schoolhouse frame and the smell of fresh-cut lumber had all witnessed. In the weeks that followed, they moved through time with a carefulness that was not hesitation but attention. He came to Harlan's Crossing every day. The Kellerman ranch work continued in the mornings, and he rode over in the afternoons, which Hal Kellerman accommodated with a quiet, knowing look, and a comment about the fence being in better shape than it had ever been anyway. They walked together in the evenings. They talked about everything. She told him more about Ohio, about her parents, about a younger sister named Pearl who had married a schoolteacher and lived in Cincinnati. She told him about learning to shoot because Thomas had insisted, and how she had discovered that she was a considerably better shot than Thomas had ever managed to be, which had amused him greatly. Bernard told her about his family, about his mother who had died when he was 12, about his father who had been a farmer with no gift for it but a great deal of stubbornness, about his brother who had come west with him, and then gone north to Montana, and was reportedly doing well raising horses. They had conversations about difficult things with a directness and a lack of performance that Bernard found continuously remarkable. She asked him once, on a cold evening in late October with the stars massive and close overhead, what he wanted from his life. "I used to think I wanted to keep moving," he said. "New territory, new work, new sky overhead. I thought that was freedom and I was not wrong," but he looked at the fire. "I think there are different kinds of freedom, and I am not sure the kind I have been practicing is the kind that sustains a person for the long haul." "What kind do you want?" she asked. He looked at her. She was watching him with the full attention she gave to things that mattered to her. "The kind that comes from having something to come back to," he said. "From there being a place and people that are yours." "That is what a homestead is," she said quietly. "I know," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. "My homestead is a good piece of land," she said. "Thomas chose well. The eastern pasture gets water year-round from a spring. There is room for cattle and horses. The house is small but sound." She paused. "I have been thinking about whether I can work it alone, whether I should try to work it alone." "Can you?" he asked, genuinely curious rather than suggesting. "Probably," she said. "I know how. I am not without capability." She looked at him. "But capability is not the same as wanting to." "No," he said, "it is not. I am not asking you to. I am not saying." She stopped and reset. "I simply want to be honest with you about the lay of the land, about where things stand and what I am thinking about." "I appreciate that," he said. "The same for me. I'm not just passing through, Wilhelmina. I have not thought of myself as just passing through in some weeks now." She looked at him for a long time in the firelight. Then she reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee. He turned his hand over and closed it around hers, and they sat that way in the warmth of the fire while the cold Arizona stars wheeled overhead, and that was a quiet kind of milestone that neither of them marked with words because it did not need marking. He moved into the foreman's position at the Kellerman Ranch in November, when the previous foreman moved his family to California. The position came with better wages and a small separate house within the ranch grounds, which meant he was no longer in the bunkhouse and no longer entirely dependent on seasonal work. He told Wilhelmina about the position and she said, "That is good. It is the right kind of work for you." And he thought she meant the stability of it, the permanence, and he thought she was right. He proposed to her at the beginning of December, which was 3 months after the fire, standing at the half-finished schoolhouse because he had been thinking of it as the right place since the evening of the first kiss, given what she had said about Thomas and the school. He was direct about it because he understood by now that directness was the right language for her, and because he was not a man given to elaborate theatrics. "I love you," he said. "I know that 3 months is not very long and that you have been through grief this year that I cannot fully understand. I am not asking you to forget any of that or to rush past any of it. I am asking you to marry me and to give us the time to build something good, and I promise you that I will work every day to be worth your saying yes." She looked at him for a long time. The desert wind moved across the flat land around them and lifted the loose strands of her hair across her face, and she did not push them away. He could see her thinking, see the careful honesty she always brought to things, working through this question the same way it worked through everything. "I love you too," she said. And then, after a pause that was only the length of a breath, "Yes." He kissed her in the unfinished schoolhouse while the wind moved through the open spaces where the walls were not yet fully built, and the desert light came in golden and clean from the west, and it felt like the right beginning of something. They were married on the second Saturday of February in 1874 in the newly completed Harlan's Crossing schoolhouse because the church had not yet been rebuilt. The entire surviving community of the settlement attended, along with people from 3 neighboring ranches and a number of Colton Creek residents who had come to know Wilhelmina through the months of settlement rebuilding. Joe Hartwell stood up with Bernard and Clara Alderman stood up with Wilhelmina. Clarence Alderman, who had recovered fully over the winter and was walking again with a cane, gave the blessing in his big, steady voice, and Margaret Alderman cried in the front row and seemed entirely content about it. Wilhelmina wore a dress of dark blue wool that she had sewn herself over the preceding weeks, which Bernard thought was the most beautiful garment he had ever seen a person wear, and he told her so. She looked at it critically and said there were 2 seams she was not entirely satisfied with. He pointed out that he did not know where the seams were, and she said that was beside the point. He laughed and she looked pleased. The ceremony was conducted by a circuit preacher named Reverend Hollies, who came through the territory every 2 months, and who had known Wilhelmina and Thomas Chandler, and spoke briefly and kindly about what it meant to build a life in difficult country, and about the particular grace of beginning again. Afterward, there was a dance in the schoolhouse yard, a fiddle player and a guitarist who played long into the evening, and people danced on the hard-packed dirt under the desert stars. Wilhelmina was not a showy dancer, but she danced well, with the same economical precision she brought to everything, and Bernard danced with her and thought he would dance with her every time there was a fiddle for the rest of his life, and that this was a very good arrangement. They spent their first night as a married couple at the Chandler homestead, which was going to become their home. Bernard had already been doing work on it, practical repairs and improvements that he had offered, and she had accepted without making a production of the acceptance, which was how they both preferred things. The house was warm, and the spring beyond the eastern pasture was running clear, and the stars above the Arizona desert were the same stars that had been overhead on all the evenings of the 4 months he had been loving this woman, and they had the particular quality of being exactly right. The following morning, Wilhelmina made breakfast in her kitchen, which was now their kitchen, and Bernard sat at the table that had been Thomas Chandler's table drinking coffee from a tin cup, while the morning sun came through the window and fell across the floorboards, and he felt the settling of something inside him, the quieting of the restlessness that had driven him across the territory for 10 years, and he understood that this was not the ending of something but the beginning. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, looking at him from the stove. "That this is a very good table," he said. She gave him a level look. "It is a perfectly ordinary table." "It is where I am going to sit every morning for the rest of my life," he said. "That makes it a very good table." She held his eyes for a moment and then shook her head, but there was warmth in it, the deep, unperformed warmth that he had been watching grow in her eyes for months, and she turned back to the stove. Spring came to the Arizona territory with the particular urgency of a land that has been waiting for it. The rains that had been absent in autumn arrived in March with notable enthusiasm, and the dry creek beds filled, and the grass came back green in a way that made the burned-out ground of the previous year seem like a very distant memory. Bernard rode out with the Kellerman cattle in the mornings and came back to the homestead in the evenings, and the work of the homestead itself, the horses Wilhelmina kept, and the garden she planted and the fences that always needed attention, filled the hours between. There was a particular ease to the life they were building, not without difficulty, because the territory was not easy and the work was hard, and the distances were long, and the weather had its own strong opinions about human plans. But ease in the sense of rightness, in the sense of 2 people whose natures were well suited to each other, and who had chosen deliberately and honestly, and who continued to choose each day. They argued sometimes. Wilhelmina had strong convictions about most things, which was one of the things Bernard loved about her, and also occasionally one of the things that made a conversation require effort. She thought he was too slow to ask for help from neighboring ranches when he should have done it earlier in the spring, when a section of the eastern fence needed replacing. He thought she took on too much of the heavy work alone when he was at the Kellerman Ranch and should have waited for him. They said these things to each other directly and without prolonged anger, and came to their respective adjustments and went on, which was the only sensible way to manage it. He told her once, after one of these necessary conversations, that he thought most marriages failed at exactly the point where honest disagreement was required, because people confused peacefulness with peace. She looked at him for a moment and then said, "Thomas used to say something similar." And then she looked at him again, and he could see her seeing both people at once, her first husband and her second, and he understood that he was not in competition with a memory and never had been, because she did not work that way. She was large enough to contain grief and love at the same time without requiring that one cancel the other, and he was grateful for it. By summer, the Chandler homestead had taken on a particular character. Wilhelmina planted a kitchen garden that grew with a persistence bordering on aggression, producing squash and beans and herbs in quantities that she distributed to half the territory. Bernard added a second corral for the horses and began the careful work of building a small herd of his own, buying horses from a rancher outside of Tucson, and working with Wilhelmina on the training of them, which was work they both found genuinely pleasurable. Clarence Alderman, who had by the fall of 1874 fully recovered his mobility with his cane and a great deal of stubborn work on his part, made it his habit to ride out to the Chandler homestead on the first Sunday of each month. He said it was to check on the fence lines on that side of the territory, which was not entirely false, but mainly it was because he had decided he liked both of them and saw no reason to forego that. Margaret Alderman sent cake. The community of Harlan's Crossing rebuilt itself with the determination of people who have been shown the worst and have decided to carry on anyway. The church went up in the summer of 1874. A new trading post was built larger than the original, which Joe Hartwell managed with his wife. The schoolhouse that Wilhelmina and Bernard and half the territory had put their hands to opened in September with 16 children enrolled, and a teacher named Miss Abigail Crawford who had come out from Missouri with both a teaching certificate and an entirely insufficient understanding of Arizona summers, but who turned out to be exactly the right person for the job once she had adjusted. Clara Alderman, who had been unconscious when she was carried out of the burning settlement that first morning, and who had spent the following months rebuilding her lungs, took a position helping Miss Crawford at the school and discovered that she was very good at it. She also, in the way that things tend to happen in small communities with restored optimism, began a correspondence with a young man named David Hale from Tucson, which became an understanding by Christmas and an engagement by spring. Wilhelmina attended the announcement party with the particular pleasure of someone who had pulled a young woman out of a burning building and is glad to see her flourishing. In October of 1874, Wilhelmina told Bernard, on a cool morning when the desert was turning its autumn gold and the horses were moving along the fence line in the long light, that she was expecting a child. He did not say anything for a moment. He was aware of the sound of the wind in the dry grass and the creak of the saddle leather and the particular blue of the sky above them, and he was aware of something very large happening inside him that had not had language yet. "Bernard," she said, with the smallest hint of uncertainty in her voice, which was rare for her and which he recognized immediately as her being, for once, not entirely sure of the ground. He reached over from his saddle and took her hand. "This is the best news I have ever been given," he said. The uncertainty left her face. "Good," she said, with enormous understatement and squeezed his hand. They told Hal Kellerman, who shook Bernard's hand with both of his and said that his wife was going to want to throw a party, which she did, with notable enthusiasm. They told Clarence and Margaret Alderman, who reacted with the joy of people who have looked at their own mortality and come out the other side with a fierce appreciation for things like new life and the continuation of the community they had fought for. They wrote to Wilhelmina's sister Pearl in Cincinnati, who wrote back a long, delighted letter full of advice that was sometimes applicable to the Arizona Territory and sometimes clearly was not. The pregnancy was not easy in all its particulars. The winter of 1874 into 1875 was hard, colder than usual, with 3 significant storms that kept them in the house for days at a time, and made the twice-weekly supply run into Harlan's Crossing an exercise in cold weather management. Wilhelmina dealt with the physical difficulty of the pregnancy with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to everything, which did not mean she pretended it was not difficult, but meant that she declined to make more of it than it was. Bernard, for his part, found that the particular quality of worry he carried about her during this time was entirely different from anything he had experienced before. He had worried about things in his life before, about cattle and weather, and the practical hazards of working country with real teeth to it. But this was different. This was the specific vulnerability of loving a person enough that their safety and well-being had become the organizing principle of your own heart's concern. He told her this one evening, not to burden her with it, but because honesty was their established language and he thought she would want to know. She listened to him and then was quiet for a moment and then said, "Thomas worried the same way." She paused. "I think it is the right kind of worry. The kind that means you care, not the kind that means you do not trust the other person to handle what comes." "That is a useful distinction," he said. "I thought so," she said. And she leaned against his shoulder in the warm kitchen with the winter going on outside, and he put his arm around her, and they stayed that way for a while. Their son was born in early April of 1875, on a morning when the spring rain was coming down clean across the desert, and the air smelled of wet sage and the mountains to the east had a new cover of snow on their tops. They named him Henry Thomas Yates. The Thomas was for the man who had loved this woman before Bernard had known her, and Bernard had suggested it himself, one evening in the winter, and Wilhelmina had looked at him for a long moment with something in her eyes that was too complex to name, and had said quietly that she thought that was right. Henry Thomas Yates was, at 8 pounds and 2 ounces, a robust and opinionated child from his first hour, which given his parentage was perhaps not surprising. Margaret Alderman served as midwife, a role she had filled for the community for 20 years, and declared him a fine, healthy boy. Clarence Alderman, allowed to see the child an hour after the birth, held him for 10 minutes with the careful solemnity of a man who knows what it means to have come close to not being here for something like this, and then gave him back and said that he had his mother's stubbornness about him already, which Margaret said was very observant for a man looking at an hour-old infant. Wilhelmina, in the aftermath of the birth, looked tired in the deep cellular way of a person who has done something very large, but she looked at her son with an expression that was simple and complete and needed no description. And she looked at Bernard and reached for his hand and said his name, and he thought of everything that had happened in the 19 months since he had first seen her riding toward a burning settlement without slowing, and he held her hand and held his son's small weight, and thought that this was the thing he had been riding toward without knowing it across all those years of open territory. The spring and summer of 1875 were the best days Bernard Yates had ever known. He would say this later, years later, in the way that people acknowledge the benchmarks of their lives. Not because nothing good came after, but because that particular season had a completeness to it, a wholeness, the way a piece of music can be whole. Henry was a sunny, curious child who quickly developed a fascination with horses that his mother had predicted and his father had encouraged, possibly to a degree that Wilhelmina felt was slightly excessive. He was also, by some mechanism that neither parent could fully account for, extremely loud in his opinions about mealtimes, which Clarence Alderman found hilarious and which Margaret Alderman said was entirely predictable given what she knew of his mother. The homestead thrived. The horse herd grew. Bernard's work as Kellerman's foreman was solid and well regarded, and by the fall of 1875, there was a quiet understanding between himself and Hal Kellerman that Bernard might eventually have the capital to buy a small piece of adjacent land and run his own operation, a conversation that remained unfinished but sat on the table between them with the patient weight of something that would come right in time. Harlan's Crossing continued to build itself back from the ashes of the previous year with a momentum that had something almost defiant about it, the determination of people who have been shown what they are capable of losing and have decided that the response to that knowledge is to build more carefully and love more openly. The school expanded. The church had regular services. 2 new families arrived from Texas in the spring of 1875 and were absorbed into the community with the particular welcome of a place that knows the value of capable neighbors. There was an afternoon in late October of 1875 when Bernard came in from the fence line to find Wilhelmina standing on the porch of the homestead with Henry on her hip, looking out toward the east where the afternoon light was coming in long and gold across the desert, and the mountains were purple and rose in the distance, and the whole enormous sky above the Arizona territory was doing what the Arizona sky did in autumn, which was essentially to make everything else look like a painting. She heard him come up the porch steps and looked at him over Henry's head. Henry reached out immediately toward Bernard with both arms, the way he always did, and Bernard took him and settled him against his side and stood beside her and looked at what she was looking at. "I was thinking," she said, "about the day of the fire." "What about it?" he said. "I was thinking about the fact that you came in after me," she said. "On that last trip, that you had been counting, apparently, and then you stopped counting and came in." He was quiet for a moment. "Did someone tell you that?" "Mrs. Pratt," she said with the faintest smile. "She said she counted too." "I did not decide to count," he said. My attention does that." She looked at him. "What made you stop counting and come in?" He thought about it honestly, the way she always deserved. "Because I could not stay outside any longer," he said. "Because you were in there and the gap was getting smaller and standing outside watching was no longer something I was able to do." She was quiet for a moment. The light moved across the desert and Henry made a small sound and reached for the button on Bernard's collar, which he always did and which Bernard always let him do. "I did not know that then," she said, "what it meant that you came in." "Neither did I," he said. "Not precisely." "I know what it meant now," she said. He looked at her. Her profile was clear and clean in the afternoon light, the line of her jaw and her nose and her brow, the chestnut hair that she still wore in the same practical knot with the strands that always came loose around her face. She was 28 years old, and she was the most certain thing he had ever been certain of. That it was going to be this, he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "This exactly." Henry, apparently satisfied with the button investigation, transferred his attention to reaching for Wilhelmina, which she accommodated with practiced ease, shifting him to her other hip with the unconscious fluency of a woman who has spent 6 months learning the particular grammar of a child's needs. She reached over with her free hand and took Bernard's hand, and they stood on the porch of their homestead in the October light with the desert stretching out before them and the mountains on the horizon and the enormous sky above. They did not say anything else for a while. There was nothing that needed to be said. The months rolled forward into winter and then spring, and spring into another summer. In 1876, Wilhelmina's sister Pearl made the journey from Cincinnati with her husband, a quiet and thoughtful man named Robert Cole, who was indeed a schoolteacher, and who spent a considerable amount of his visit being politely overwhelmed by the scale of the territory and the directness of his sister-in-law. Pearl herself was everything her letters had suggested, warm and bright, and opinionated in a way that was similar to Wilhelmina's but more voluble, which Wilhelmina said was because Pearl had always done both their shares of talking even as children. The visit lasted 3 weeks and was, by general consensus, excellent. Pearl took to Bernard within the first 2 days with the swiftness of someone who has been worried about her sister and is relieved to find the worry was unnecessary. She told Robert quietly on their second evening at the homestead that Bernard Yates looked at Wilhelmina the way their father had looked at their mother, which was the highest standard Pearl possessed. Robert, who had his own good standard of observation, agreed. There was a conversation between Wilhelmina and Pearl one afternoon when the men were out with the horses and Henry was sleeping, the kind of conversation that sisters who have been separated by geography and circumstance and grief have when they finally have private time and a pot of tea. Bernard did not hear this conversation and did not need to, but Wilhelmina came in from it with her eyes brighter than usual and her expression carrying something that he recognized as the particular wholeness of having been fully known by someone who has always known you. He asked her if the conversation had been good, and she said, "Pearl said you are worth keeping," and he laughed, and she smiled in the way that was still the most beautiful thing in his world. The summer of 1876 also brought a development in the form of a proposition from Hal Kellerman, who was 55 years old and finding the full running of the ranch increasingly demanding on his health. Kellerman offered Bernard the opportunity to purchase the eastern quarter section of the ranch land on terms that were fair, and that reflected a genuine regard. The land abutted the Chandler homestead's northern fence line and would triple their grazing acreage. Bernard and Wilhelmina discussed it for 3 evenings in their careful and honest way, going over the finances and the practical implications and the work it would require. On the 4th morning, over breakfast, Wilhelmina set down her coffee cup and said, "I think we should do it." "So do I," he said. "The eastern spring will be shared water with the Kellerman remainder once we fence it properly," she said. "That means the water agreement will need to be. I have already drafted the language," he said. She looked at him. "Of course you have." "I thought about it at 2 in the morning," he said. "I thought about the spring fencing at 3, she said. They looked at each other across the breakfast table. Henry, in his chair, was engaged in the systematic destruction of a biscuit. "We are well matched," she said, with the precise gravity of a person making a legal statement. "Extraordinarily well matched," he agreed and drank his coffee. The land purchase was completed in September of 1876 with the assistance of a lawyer from Tucson, who rode out to formalize the documents and seemed deeply impressed by the thoroughness of the Yates prepared questions, which he said were more organized than most of the ranch transactions he had seen. Hal Kellerman shook hands with both of them, because he had long since understood that it was both of them who had built this, and that the handshake should reflect it, and his wife brought a fruit cake that was exceptional. The combined property was now substantial by the standards of the territory, not the largest operation, but respectable and sound, with water security and good grazing land, and the horses Wilhelmina had been building up for 2 years becoming a known quantity in the region. Bernard continued as foreman for the Kellerman Remainder Ranch, managing the transition so that neither operation suffered, and by the end of 1876, they had hired a young hand named Pete Lassiter, who was 19 years old, diligent, and very good with horses, and who lived in the small foreman's house that Bernard had vacated and took to the work with the enthusiasm of someone who has found the thing they are suited to. Henry Yates grew into a bright, vigorous, horse-mad child who was the particular delight of Clarence Alderman, who taught him to play checkers at an age that was probably too young for it, and then pretended to be surprised when Henry became very good at it. He was his mother's son in his directness and his father's son in his quiet stubbornness, which Wilhelmina said was not a comfortable combination to parent, but was probably a good combination for life. He had Bernard's eyes and Wilhelmina's jaw, and a laugh that came from somewhere all his own. In the spring of 1877, Wilhelmina told Bernard she was expecting again. She told him at the kitchen table in the morning directly, in the same factual way she had told him the first time, and then watched him with the same slight vulnerability she had shown the first time, which he thought was because she was always most truthful about her own uncertainty when it mattered most. He said, "This is still the best kind of news," and she said, "Good," in the same way she had the first time, and he kissed her over the kitchen table, and Henry, who was now old enough to have opinions about most things, said from his chair, "Again, Papa." Their daughter was born in December of 1877, in a cold, clear spell when the desert stars were immense, and the horses in the corral breathed clouds of white into the night air. They named her Rose Ellen Yates. She was smaller than Henry had been and quieter, and from the beginning she had a watchful stillness about her that was its own kind of intelligence. She had Wilhelmina's chestnut hair from the first, and Henry, when shown his new sister, regarded her for a long moment and then said that she was all right. This was considered high praise from a 2.5-year-old boy. Margaret Alderman, as midwife for this second birth as she had been for the first, declared Rose Ellen a fine, healthy girl and sat with Wilhelmina through the long evening afterward while Bernard sat with Henry in the kitchen and told him, in the most accurate and age-appropriate terms he could manage, what had happened and what it meant. Henry had questions, many questions. Bernard answered them all. Clara Alderman, who was now Clara Hale and living in Tucson with David Hale but who had ridden out as soon as she heard the news, arrived on the following morning and pronounced Rose a beauty, and then cried a small amount, which she blamed on the cold. She held the baby for an hour and then helped Bernard with the noon meal because Wilhelmina was sleeping and someone needed to keep the household moving. And while they worked in the kitchen, Clara said to Bernard, in the frank way of someone who has known a person through enough important moments to speak plainly, "You are good for her. You were good for her from the beginning." "She has been good for me," Bernard said. "That too," Clara said. "But you both know that I am saying the other thing." He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "I owe both of you a great deal," she said simply. "I am aware of it every day." "You do not owe us anything," he said. "Maybe not," she said. "But I am glad you exist, both of you, and I am glad she stopped riding into burning buildings." "She has not entirely stopped," he said. "The instinct is still very much present." Clara looked at him and then laughed, a full, genuine laugh, and he laughed with her. And in the other room their voices woke Rose Ellen, who began to express her opinions clearly, and the day went on. The years settled into themselves with the depth and texture of a well-made life. The homestead prospered. The horse operation became a recognized enterprise in the territory, with Wilhelmina's eye for bloodlines and Bernard's patience in training producing animals that were sought after from as far as New Mexico. Pete Lassiter, their hired hand, developed into an excellent horseman who stayed with them year after year and became less employee and more part of the household, the kind of relationship that was common on good frontier operations where the work and the people who do it cannot be entirely separated. Harlan's Crossing grew. By 1879, it had a population that had more than recovered from the fire of 1873 and had developed beyond it, with a new general store, a small hotel for traveling merchants, a barber shop, and a proper church building that was also used for the community meetings that continued to be the mechanism by which the settlement made its collective decisions. The school had expanded to 2 rooms, and Miss Crawford, who had become Mrs. Miles in 1877 after marrying the new blacksmith, still taught the older students with the committed enthusiasm that had always characterized her. Joe Hartwell rebuilt the livery into a proper operation and extended it to include a small freight service, which was increasingly needed as the territory's traffic grew. He was a steadfast presence in the community, the kind of person who shows up for every difficulty and every celebration with equal reliability, and Bernard had a genuine friendship with him that had grown from the chaos of the fire into something solid and regular. Saturday evening checkers at the Harlan's Crossing Saloon, which had been rebuilt and was considerably more civilized than most saloons in the territory, because its owner had made a decision to make it a place where families could also come, which the women of the settlement had supported enthusiastically and several of the older ranchers had complained about, and then adapted to. The injustices of the territory were not invisible to either of them. The Apache families who had moved through the land for generations were being pushed steadily by the pressures of settlement and policy, a wrong that was large and systematic, and that neither Bernard nor Wilhelmina could fix, but that they refused to pretend was not occurring. When a family of Apache people came to the homestead fence one spring morning in 1878, 3 women and 4 children, exhausted and hungry, Wilhelmina brought them food and water and did not make it complicated. Bernard spoke with the oldest woman through the limited shared language that the territory produced, and they understood each other well enough to convey the basic necessities. He knew his gesture was small against the scale of what was happening to those people, and to all the communities being displaced, and he was honest with Wilhelmina that evening about the inadequacy of any individual act against a systemic injustice. She said, "You do what you can do, and you do not look away from what you cannot change." Both things matter. He thought she was right, as she frequently was. Henry Yates, growing into a serious and horse-capable child of 6 and 7 and 8, was given as full an education as the frontier permitted, and an honest one. Wilhelmina taught him at home in addition to the schoolhouse, and one of the things she taught him was that the land they worked had belonged to people before them, and still had claims that went beyond legal title. She taught it without drama, as fact, the same way she taught him mathematics and reading, because she believed that a person should know the true history of the ground they stand on. Rose Ellen Yates was quieter than Henry but no less perceptive. By the time she was 3, she was following her mother through the kitchen garden, with the same focused attention that Bernard had first seen in Wilhelmina standing beside a water trough. She had a gift for growing things that expressed itself early and consistently. By the time she was 5, she had her own small plot of the garden, and managed it with a seriousness that made the adults smile, and that Wilhelmina honored with genuine respect, because she understood that competence at any age deserves to be treated as real. There was a particular evening in the winter of 1879 when all 4 of them were in the kitchen after the evening meal, the fire going well, and the wind outside doing what winter wind does in the Arizona territory, which is to remind the land that December is serious. Henry was at the table with a book. Rose was on the floor with a collection of smooth stones she used for her own private purposes that nobody entirely understood, but that seemed to involve a complex organizational system. Bernard was at the stove with a second cup of coffee, and Wilhelmina was at the table beside Henry helping him with a mathematics problem that had been defeating him for 3 evenings. Bernard looked at the 4 of them in the warm kitchen and felt something that was not complicated at all. It was just the very large and simple fact of this life, this particular arrangement of people and warmth and work and belonging, and it was more than anything he had known how to want back in the years when he had been riding open country alone under the enormous sky. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He drank his coffee and watched the firelight on the faces of the people he loved, and was entirely, profoundly, completely where he was meant to be. In the spring of 1880, Wilhelmina told him she thought they should put another room on the house. The children were growing, and the space was becoming a genuine practical consideration. Bernard said he agreed, and that he had been thinking about a design since January. She said she had also been thinking about a design since December. They compared notes at the kitchen table with pencil sketches, and a comfortable predictability to the way their minds had reached similar conclusions by different routes, which was one of the persistent pleasures of being married to a person who thought carefully. The addition went up over the summer with the help of Joe Hartwell and Pete Lassiter and David Hale, who came out from Tucson for 2 weekends to help, which was also an occasion for Clara to visit, and for the general warmth of people who care about each other to express itself in the practical form of shared labor and good meals. Henry, 8 years old and convinced he was considerably more useful than was entirely accurate, helped with every step he was permitted to help with, and talked about the construction in detail to anyone who would listen, including Rose Ellen, who was too young to understand most of it and listened patiently anyway, which Henry found very satisfying. When the room was finished and the children had been settled into the new arrangement, Wilhelmina and Bernard stood in the yard in the late summer evening looking at the expanded house. The desert was going its evening colors, the particular reds and pinks and golds that it did when the light was right, and the horses were moving in the corral, and the smell of the sage and the clean, dry warmth of the Arizona dusk was the same smell it had been on all the evenings they had been here together. "It looks like a real house now," Wilhelmina said. "It was always a real house," Bernard said. "You know what I mean," she said. "It looks like a house that intends to be here for a long time." "It does," he said, "because it does intend to be here for a long time." She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, the same easy and natural way they had come to everything together, without ceremony, without fuss, just the clean, honest fit of two people who know each other entirely. "Bernard," she said. "Yes," he said. "Do you know what I have been thinking about lately?" "What?" he said. "That morning," she said. "The morning of the fire. I have been thinking about how many things had to be exactly what they were for any of this to happen. You had to be riding that particular fence line, and you had to see the smoke and ride toward it, and you had to arrive at exactly the time you did and not 20 minutes earlier or later, and you had to have rope in your saddlebag." "I always have rope," he said. "I know," she said. "But that is part of it, the kind of person who always has rope, the kind of person who soaks his bandana and comes into the building." She paused. "I was not thinking about any of that at the time. I was thinking about getting the aldermans out, but I think about it now." "What do you conclude?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. The desert light moved around them. Rose Ellen's voice came from inside the house, asking Henry something, and Henry's answer was inaudible but evidently satisfactory because the voices went quiet again. "That some things have the shape of necessity about them," she said. "Not fate, I'm not certain I believe in that exactly, but necessity, like they could not have been any other way once the conditions were right." He thought about this. "I think I believe that," he said. "About this specifically." She tilted her head to look up at him. Her eyes were warm and clear and entirely present, the direct gaze that had been the first thing he had noticed about her, and that he had been grateful for every day since. "So do I," she said. He kissed the top of her head. She settled more comfortably against his side. They stood in the yard of their homestead in the big warm evening, with their house behind them full of the voices of their children, and the horses moving in the corral with the unhurried ease of animals that are well kept and contented, and the desert spreading out before them in every direction to the blue mountains on the horizon, and the sky above all of it doing what the Arizona sky always does, which is to be vast and indifferent and utterly magnificent, and to make everything beneath it feel both very small and very precisely significant. Bernard Yates had ridden into a burning settlement on an autumn morning in 1873 because there was a woman riding in who needed rope and hands, and he had both. He had counted her trips without meaning to, because that was what his attention did when something mattered to it. He had stopped counting on the 7th trip and gone in with her, because the alternative had become impossible. He had not known then what he was riding toward. He had not known her name or her history or the particular quality of her directness, or the way she looked at a problem or the sound of her laugh, or the fact that she would name her son Thomas and extend coffee to strangers at the end of impossible mornings, or teach her children the truth about the land they lived on, or stand in the yard of a homestead at dusk and say, with a quiet certainty that moved like water through stone, that some things could not have been any other way. He knew all of it now. He had known it for 7 years, and he would know it for every year after this one, and the knowing of it was the ground he stood on, and the air he breathed, and the thing that made the enormous and indifferent and magnificent Arizona sky, every single morning of his life, look exactly right. Inside the house, Rose Ellen said something that made Henry laugh. The horses in the corral settled toward their evening quiet. The first stars were beginning to come through the fading blue above the mountains. Wilhelmina Chandler Yates, who had once ridden toward a burning settlement without slowing, looked at the stars and then at her husband, and he looked back at her with everything he had and everything he was, and the night came down around them warm and full and entirely, perfectly, resolved.